Great. Okay, welcome. Good evening. Thank you for coming tonight to the School of Social Work. I'm delighted to see so many people here at 5:30 on a evening. My name is Shauna Lee. I'm an associate professor here at the School of Social Work. My colleague, Professor Trina Shanks, and I are co-directors of the Learning Community on Poverty and Inequality, which is supported by the School of Social Work and Dean Lynn Videcka, and is sponsoring tonight's event. I'd also point out Joyce Lee is helping to organize the events with us, the extraordinary doctoral student in GSRA for this project. So thank you for participating in the Learning Community on Poverty and Inequality. We seek, through the LCPI, to bring a diverse array of perspectives to address topics of poverty and inequality from a social justice perspective to the schools of social work in the university community. And as I mentioned earlier, we thank the Dean for supporting the LCPI in tonight's event. And for all of you, thank you for being here again. Before I introduce tonight's speakers, I'd just like to make a quick plug for some of our upcoming LCPI events. In case you're interested in joining us for future events, which usually occur on Fridays at noon. We have Marcy Ibarra coming from the University of Chicago School of Social Service Administration on the 26th. Stacy Patton coming on February 9 to discuss a book that she wrote about spanking or corporal punishment of children and the African American community. On the 16th, Heather Nauer, over in the audience, a postdoctoral fellow here at the School of Social Work, will be talking about her work in rural Kenya to do intervention work there with parents to promote children's literacy. And then on the 6th of April, we have Jessica Gordon-Nimrod coming from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice to talk about cooperatives and community-based asset building in Black communities. So we have quite a robust schedule, and this is the kind of the kickoff event for our winter semester. I also want to mention we're teaching a mini course as a part of LCPI. This is our inaugural event for the mini course. If you're an MSW student and you'd like to register, let me know. I think there's 3 spots open, so we'd be delighted to fill those spots. But okay, now on to the main event. I'm, again, just thrilled to introduce Congressman Dan Kildee and Mr. John Gallagher from the Detroit Free Press, business writer. They are here to talk about their perspectives on how place matters and the future of urban planning in Flint and Detroit. And it really is a great honor to have Congressman Kildee come, who represents Michigan's 5th district, which includes the city of Flint, as probably most of you know. And Mr. Gallagher, who through his reporting for the Detroit Free Press has extensively covered the city of Detroit for over 30 years and has written a number of excellent books, including Reimagining Detroit and Revolution Detroit, which you can get through the library, read online, or you could purchase. But yeah, purchase preferred. However, if you like to check out those books, they are available through the library system for free to U of M students. So to tell you a little bit more about our 2 speakers, Congressman Dan Kildee was born and raised in Flint, Michigan. Now in his 3rd term in Congress, he has focused on addressing key issues, including protecting the Great Lakes, fighting blight in cities and towns across Michigan, and getting aid to Flint families in response to the city's water crisis. He recently launched a new initiative, The Future of America's Cities and Towns, to change the way Congress thinks about and invests in older industrial communities across the nation. Mr. John Gallagher, again, as I mentioned, is a reporter for the Detroit Free Press. He's a veteran journalist and author who covers urban and economic redevelopment in Detroit and Michigan. His book, Reimagining Detroit, Opportunities for Redesigning an American City, was named by the Huffington Post as among the best social and political books in 2010. To both of you, thank you again for joining us this evening to share your perspectives. What was I going to say here? Just as a point of kind of agenda or flow, Congressman Kildee will speak first for a little while, then hand the stage over to Mr. Gallagher, and then we'll open up hopefully for a very robust Q&A session with all of you for the remainder of this evening's event. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Does this thing work? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I don't have a microphone. This is my normal voice. No, does this work?
do actually have a microphone.
I can just stand back here if that's better.
You can walk around though. I
Oh.
think people probably prefer.
I like walking around.
Yeah. There you go.
All right. Thank you very much. So, first of all, thanks for inviting me to do this. It's always good to be here and talk about what I think is the most important subject. It's a subject that's been part of my work for as long as I can remember. So what I thought I'd do is just talk a little bit about this larger question of place and how policy, I think, in many ways undermines opportunity and living conditions, quality of life for a whole subset of American cities, largely older industrial cities in the Northeast and Midwest, but some other places too, and how I think policy has affected that. And then a couple of thoughts about my hometown of Flint, which is a very sad case study of a lot of those, I think, fundamental problems in the way we approach the question of cities and the people who live there. And then John will make some remarks, and he and I both kind of concluded that it's probably better to reserve more time for interaction and questions, and so we'll try to be relatively brief. I've known John for a long time, since we crossed paths when I was a local public official in Flint. I was the county treasurer, which means I was the tax collector in Flint, Michigan, the job I laid awake at night as a child dreaming of. But it was in that role that I began to work on blight and on abandonment in my hometown. And John, as was said, was doing some of the most important journalism on that subject and other subjects related. So that's where we crossed paths. So it's good to be back here with him. So I just launched this effort in Congress. I've been in Congress for 5 years. I was in local government for a long time. I was on the school board in Flint many, many, many years ago, and then county government for 25 years. I helped develop the concept of the modern land bank, which is the work that I was doing as county treasurer. And then I launched a national organization working on these issues across the country. So when I came to Congress, I thought if I really worked hard, that I would get maybe to be one of the many voices working on behalf of cities in Congress. And I got there and I realized I was at the front of the line. It really was not a subject that was being discussed much in that place. And that's sort of part of the problem generally, is that we have essentially at the federal government level abdicated our responsibility for the conditions in cities. And to a great extent, I've never served in state government, we've seen the same thing though. To a great extent, you've seen the same thing, where cities are treated as essentially self-contained, self-supported communities. And the state and the federal government, which both have a huge stake in those places, in communities, in cities especially, rely on those cities to sort of fend for themselves. And that's really, I think, the foundational problem with the connection between place and poverty, is that it used to be that these communities were pretty functional, self-contained communities. People who lived in cities worked in them, and vice versa. Economies have regionalized, the economies have globalized, but communities have regionalized. Wealth is more distributed through the regions, but those essential places, those cities which have always and should be the beating heart of a functional region, are left behind to kind of take care of themselves. We were talking a little bit earlier about what happened in my hometown of Flint. It's a city that was the place where General Motors was formed in 1908. Once had 76,000 people working for one company in a city that never had more than 200,000 people. Peak population was 1960 census, 197,000, 193,000 in 1970, and then downhill from there. The point is this: the world changed, industry changed, suburbanization racial avoidance, investment in transportation that really helped it and made it very efficient for people to live outside of that urban center. We essentially funded the relocation of wealth and economic activity out of cities without doing anything to make sure that the essential elements of that city are supported. So what we have is an unsustainable model to support quality of life in those older places. There is no way to touch on all those elements in the brief time we have. I'd be happy to answer any specific questions, but suffice to say this, and I think there's plenty of evidence for this. In this country, since we're a relatively young country, we treat cities, especially these older industrial cities, as if they've sort of had their birth in the era of industrial growth, their life during the period, sort of the heyday. We all know what those were. For Flint, it was the 40s, 50s, 60s. And then a decline as a result of a change in the economy and the change in communities, but it's not treated as a decline that can be then followed by another period of growth. It's treated like the birth, life, and death of a place. And in fact, the thing that's most unnerving to me about this is that policy in general, and policymakers, some of them specifically, essentially blame the people left behind in these distressed cities as a result of these big changes that are beyond the control, for the most part, beyond the control of the people who live there or the elected officials that represent them or serve them. But they tend to blame the people who live in these places for the conditions they're in, as if they should have done something about their problem. As if this decay that they face, the fact that the parks are closed and the schools are failing, is a result of either corruption or mismanagement. And sometimes there's corruption, and sometimes there's mismanagement. But I would argue more often in these really distressed places, those are symptoms of a problem, not necessarily the cause. And that's often missed. I think it's missed almost entirely. Evidence of that is, thinking about from a state policy standpoint, the solutions prescribed for a city that is really struggling. And what does that mean? It's a population that's increasingly poor, that has access to very few public services. The safety net is full of holes. There's very little, for kids especially, very little opportunity to experience the things that help a child grow and develop in a way that we would like them to. But the state's solution to a city that's really struggling is, number one, pull the plug on one of the essential sources of funding, eliminate direct revenue sharing to the cities, because it's treated as a waste of money. They don't say it in those terms. That's sort of the clear message, is that these places can't be saved. And why would we spend more money on these places when we have our own budget problems? If it's Lansing, it's them. So the solution is, when a city is really struggling to the point that the municipal government is not even able to be financially sustainable, is not to come in with new investment, not to come in to backfill the loss of revenue that is largely, again, driven by trends that are beyond the control of the people operating or living in that city. They come in with new management, as if it's only a management failure, and that new management with only one set of tools, not the ability to add, but only the ability to subtract, to cut, to suspend democracy and cut further, so that we treat these cities, and I'm going to have to wrap here in a second, but it's an important point. We treat the cities as if they are a municipal corporation. When the municipal corporation is formed to provide support and services, and the essential functions of democracy to the city, but the city is not the municipal corporation. It's not the city government. The city is this economic and social organism. It's a collection of people living in the same place. You can't bankrupt that. You can't treat that with balance sheet solutions to what is essentially a human problem, and you can't dissolve it. But the model that is used to think about the sustainability of these places is the same model that is used for failing corporations. Assign new management, grant that management extraordinary power to make financial decisions, to restructure, get them to the point where their balance sheet is solvent, but not to deal in any meaningful way with the quality of the experience of the people who live there. There's a professor who once taught here until the late 70s, a guy named Robert Putnam. I don't know if you've read much of Robert Putnam, right? Our Kids. There's a book I think he wrote and came out in 2015. But one of the most interesting elements in that book is the difference between affluent and middle-class kids and what they have in real dollars expended on their behalf for the broad range of cultural and enriching experiences that those kids have access to versus what, say, a kid in Flint is going to have expended on their behalf to help them grow their brain, explore new things. That's a function of place. I mean, we see about $7,000 spent on affluent kids a year and about $700 of total expenditures for a poor kid on those experiences. Not enough to put them on a trajectory that allows them to be the most interesting and productive person they can possibly be. So all this depression and all this blight and all this abandonment and all these parks that aren't mowed and all these schools that are crumbling and these empty buildings that are just reminders of failure. It's not just about the aesthetic of the community that those kids grow up in. Their lives are forever changed. Growing up in a poor place like that, that's a result of policy choices that we have made. These are policy choices. To say that a city has to function and can only support itself through the revenue generated through taxation from activity right in that place is not an accurate way to support what is supposed to be this really strong core of a highly functional region. These places really matter. And I'll end with this because we could go a lot longer on this. These places matter to all of us. This idea that somehow it's okay that there's 50 American cities that have lost half of their population in the last few decades and are really struggling to just stay barely above water, that's okay is morally kind of a bankrupt thought in the first place. But even if one could somehow talk themselves through that, it's just the sort of the fiscal and economic implications of that are not sustainable either. And so there are other models. I've spent some time working on this issue of cities losing population. We called them shrinking cities. Got a lot of attention. There are other models that help a community go through these periods of growth, followed by natural periods of economic sort of contraction and decline, and allows them to sort of be positioned for the next wave. But if everything falls apart, if there's not state level and federal level support for those places that has the effect of smoothing the impact of these periods of economic ebb and flow, then we essentially sentence these places to a really dark and deep decline. But like in Leipzig, Germany, for example, after German reunification in the late 80s, early 90s, I can't remember the date. I've been out of school long enough where I can't remember. Leipzig lost about 20% of its population just like that. They went to the west. but they had a different model. I mean, any community that would have lost 20% of its population essentially would have been bankrupt, because these cities tend to operate on really thin margins. Losing 20% of your population and the economic activity associated with them would tip them right over. But there they have a federal role in supporting cities, a state, essentially regional role in supporting cities, and then the local revenues that come. There's this sort of smoothing effect that has, so that the ebb and flow can be sustained. In Michigan and in most of the Northeast and Midwestern United States, the old Northwest Ordinance places, where we have these small box governments, almost entirely now, that city is on its own. In those, that ebb and flow that is natural in an economy puts those places so far behind that even with a macro economy that's in growth, they can't catch up. Last point I'll make, because I know I'm almost done. One of the big fears that I have, and this is something that's important for the decisions that we made in the near future, is that even President Trump, two words that I have a hard time smashing into one sentence, but I mean, I'm not a big Trump fan, just to be clear. But he's talked about going big on infrastructure. And what I have been pushing for, and this is why I launched the cities and town thing, is that if we're not really smart about how, say, $1 trillion or $2 trillion or $3 trillion would be deployed across this country, if we don't anticipate the potential positive and negative impact that kind of investment could have on places that are so anchored to the bottom of the ocean that the rising tide won't raise them. I mean, places like Flint, if we don't figure out a way to disproportionately help them, what we could end up seeing is not just those communities not benefiting from massive new investment in roads, bridges, rails, ports, IT, et cetera, but we could actually exacerbate the disparity between old and emerging places, because we will create an even more efficient magnet to other places out of those tired old communities. That's what I mean. The unintended consequence of a very good thing, which was the development of the interstate highway system, largely in the 1950s and 60s, really, but it started with post-war era. It was in the macro a good thing, in the aggregate a good thing for this country, for sure. But we also know that it had the effect of emptying out a lot of places that were pretty decent places at one point in time. And it, with all these other trends, exacerbated a problem that was going to be hard enough to deal with. I've gone on long enough, and I think John probably can take it from here, and then we'll take questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, as Dan said, we could talk all night about some of these issues. So I thought I'd start with a phrase you probably have heard, which is two Detroits. Two Detroits is a phrase we've heard a lot these days. It implies that we have two cities in Detroit, one doing very well, serving the sort of the business class or the educated class, and one, and then everything else. Sometimes simplified to downtown is doing great and the neighborhoods are doing terribly. It's a simplification. It's not entirely accurate. I think downtown Detroit has a long way to go, despite all the great stuff that has happened down there in the last 10 years. We are light years ahead of where we were 10 years ago in downtown, but no one is going to mistake downtown Detroit for downtown Chicago or San Francisco or someplace. Still lots of vacancy, lots of empty buildings, lots of vacant lots. And not everything is terrible in the neighborhoods. Not too long ago, I looked at some data from the 300 census tracts in the city of Detroit. Each census tract covers about a few square blocks and a few thousand residents. And of the 300 census tracts in the city, about 100 had median income going up and poverty rates going down. So the numbers were moving in the right direction. And in the other 200 census tracts, they were moving in the wrong direction. And as I ride around the city, I think that's roughly about right, that about a third of the neighborhoods in the city seem to be doing better. Some are doing real good. Some of the classic ones like Indian Village and Palmer Woods, which are very high end and homes selling for $500,000 or more. Not long ago, there was a bike tour that went through Indian Village, and someone asked the leader, "What suburb is this?" Even though it's in the city. And then there are those neighborhoods like Verner Highway in Southwest Detroit, the Hispanic neighborhood, or West Village on the east side that are doing much better. Home prices going up and storefronts filling up. But there's probably at least 2/3 of the city that are still largely awaiting any kind of good stuff. So, what makes a difference? Well, I think the presence of a nonprofit community group in the neighborhoods, a community development organization, or CDC, Community Development Corporation. These are nonprofit groups, neighborhood-based, run by people in the neighborhoods. That if you have a good one, they tend to have a paid staff, which is very important, a paid director and a paid staff, with a variety of skill sets: economic development, business attraction, grant writing, urban planning, and so on. Some of the best ones, the most famous ones, are Midtown Detroit Inc., run by Sue Mosey for the last 30 years, which is largely responsible for the revival of Midtown. And in Southwest Detroit, the Southwest Detroit Business Association, which engineered the first BID, Business Improvement District, in the city, in which property owners tax themselves a little bit extra, and that money goes into beautification projects, graffiti removal, and that kind of stuff. So there is some progress being made, but there's a lot that is not being made. And the big difference, I think, is one of these community development groups. So to the extent that we can promote those in some way, that's really important. There are some cities that do much better than that. Cleveland, I think, does much better in providing municipal support, city hall support to some of these groups. And Detroit, I'm told by virtually everybody outside of City Hall, everybody in these neighborhood groups, that they don't have enough support from City Hall. I'd like to talk a little bit about what's made a difference in Detroit, because we do have this narrative, if you follow this shrinking cities problem, that a lot of these cities are beginning to come back. Pittsburgh, Detroit, Leipzig, Manchester, England, Turin, Italy. First, you get control of the land, the vacant land. You repurpose the old factories. And Dan mentioned Leipzig. One of their famous factories, the Spinnerei, was a textile factory. It closed when communism collapsed and they no longer supported their industry. That factory closed. Some huge place, 700,000 square feet. It became an artist colony. Not because the city wanted it to be. The artists began to move in, and the city let it happen. The city understood that they could not finance this at all. When I was there, one of the officials said, "All we can give them is freedom. We can't give them money. We just give them freedom." So that filled up with artists. In Detroit, we see indoor agriculture. We see artist colonies. We see housing projects taking place in a lot of these places. The land bank that Dan mentioned has done enormous work. And Dan deserves the credit for inventing the modern land bank. He really is one of the most innovative projects that's happened in cities. In Detroit, where we had something like 100,000 vacant lots in the city and 40 or 50,000 vacant buildings, almost half the parcels in the city had been abandoned. And I used to say that the problem is that nobody knows who owns all that land. Not only had it been abandoned for 20 or 30 years, but a lot of it had been subject to mortgage fraud and title fraud and 6 other kinds of fraud, and nobody knew who owned it. And if you were a neighbor living in a home in one of the neighborhoods and you wanted to buy the vacant lot next to your house so you could fence it in and make a garden, you'd go down to City Hall and you could spend months trying to get somebody to tell you even who owned it, let alone allow you to buy it. And now that the land bank has been established in Detroit, they have completely turned that system around. And now for $100 and half an hour of your time, you can buy the vacant lot next to you. The land bank has sold 8,000 to 10,000 vacant lots to neighbors. They've auctioned off hundreds of homes that are either move-in ready or almost move-in ready to people who want to buy them. They have cleaned up a lot of the nuisance property by filing lawsuits against the people and getting people to voluntarily clean up the property. And they've cleared title on this property, so now it's no longer a mystery who owns this land. So we're beginning to get a handle on the land in the city. We also did something very interesting in Detroit that's not entirely open to a lot of other cities, but we began to spin off municipal functions into these nonprofit groups because, as Dan said, the municipalities are completely underfunded, tragically underfunded. And so things like Eastern Market, the public market in Detroit, Cobo Center, the Historical Society, the DIA, Workforce Development, the water system, public lighting, all these were spun off into nonprofit boards, authorities, public conservancies. And in most cases, they've completely turned around these organizations. So now two of the coolest places in Detroit, Eastern Market and Cobo Center, have been completely turned around by getting them out of the hands of a dysfunctional and underfunded city government and putting them into these nonprofit management boards that can get outside funding and professional management. I think the philanthropy has played a huge role in Detroit, most notably with the Grand Bargain during the bankruptcy, when the foundations pumped about $300 million into the bankruptcy to shore up the pensions of municipal retirees and also basically rescue the art of the DIA, so none of the art was sold. Philanthropy has played a huge role. Entrepreneurship is beginning to play a big role. We Flint and Detroit both shared this automotive economy for 100 years. I remember Dan said once at a thing that Flint was exporting cars to the world and importing cash, and you knew it was never going to end, right? Well, of course, it ended in Detroit and in Flint. And I quote you in my next book, by the way. Is that okay? And when that collapsed, when that whole system collapsed, and we no longer had that system to provide jobs for life to 18-year-olds who didn't need a college education just by walking down to the factory gate when you got out of high school. We were beginning to replace that with a more entrepreneurial system. We have a long way to go there. So the narrative that you hear that cities like Detroit and Pittsburgh and Leipzig and Turin are making a comeback, that is to some extent true, but we are in the very early stages of this. And I agree with Dan completely that we need to provide some better political balance so that cities are not left out on their own. I would say if this is a 30 or 40 year process, we're maybe 5 to 10 years into it. So at least 75% of the reimagining of cities is yet to take place. And it's not going to take place unless we get the public policy right. And then on top of that, occasionally you have what I call the asteroid strike, which in Flint was the water crisis. Flint was doing better coming along, just like Detroit was coming along. And then, the emergency manager switches them off Flint water, off Detroit water, and poisons an entire city, which will take decades to recover from. So the narrative of a comeback, which we like to celebrate, that's true, sort of, but we have a very long way to go. Things are better than they used to be, but we still have a huge amount of work still to do. So with that, we'll take questions. So. Well, we can share it.
Yeah.
We'll see if we can get this to work.
All right.
Okay. You guys can do this, and I'll go around and get questions.
Okay.
Yeah, you'll need.
Okay, I see a woman right here.
Green light.
Okay.
So,
I wanted to ask you about Detroit. The mayor recently proposed, and I think City Council partially established, a plan to have small business centers in the various neighborhoods around the city, with the idea that the neighborhood might build up about that. What's your view of that strategy?
Sure. Well, it's one of the things that we're working on, which is to try to get entrepreneurialism back into these neighborhoods. And they have a lot of programs, actually. There's one called Motor City Match, where the city matches vacant storefronts, that is landlords, with entrepreneurs who need space and tries to put them together. And that's one thing. They also, TechTown, the business incubator, has a program called SWAT City, where they are working with neighborhood entrepreneurs, mostly on retail in those neighborhoods. And then there's a lot of other job training programs, that kind of stuff. And so it's absolutely necessary that we get some economic drive back into these neighborhoods. That's the one thing we need more than anything else.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, I think that's exactly right. I think in the macro, again, this gets into an area that I know has lots of different facets to it, but Um, if we blow it on immigration policy, which has really been the driver of a lot of entrepreneurship in a lot of places, including cities, then we're going to make that hill a little bit taller to climb. I was pleased a couple of years ago when it looked as if the state government and the federal government was going to align around a real focus on immigration as a way to bring entrepreneurship into cities and revitalize those economies, in part with thoughtful approaches to immigration. But both at the state and federal level, there's been a pretty significant change in that thinking. But I think that's an area where we should keep our eyes open on that.
Question here?
Hi, my name is Heather. Thank you very much for your interesting talks. I just had a question about revival of these cities and learning lessons from cities. I am most acutely familiar with San Francisco. I just moved here from there. Learning from San Francisco and even Oakland, there's been a lot of spillover of this gentrification where communities that existed during the decline of the city are now being pushed out by gentrification. So what are the lessons that we can learn thinking ahead for cities like Flint and Detroit?
I think one important lesson, and this is where the specific sort of policies make a big difference, because in the large scope, we really hope for new interest in investment, because that actually is what it will take to make these communities more sustainable. What we need to work against is that new investment essentially pushing out the people who were left behind, who tend to be more poor. And there are ways to do that. And it is in a set of techniques that are used when it comes to development that essentially require inclusion of affordable housing and essentially in all new development. I did this when John mentioned, and I did as well, the land bank. So I started the Genesee County Land Bank. One of the things, because we couldn't find any developers in Flint, we have them now. We have sort of a miniature version of what's been going on here. But because I was the county treasurer and I formed this land bank, we took title to all these properties. And so when I would sell property for development, I required a long-term agreement to integrate affordable housing into market rate housing. Minimum of 10%, sometimes about 40% of the units that were developed, all these new units, had to be reserved for affordable housing. That's one way, is to use the tools that local governments have and the financing tools that are given to these nonprofits, for example, to create partnerships so that we're not trying to keep the private for-profit investor out. But what we're saying to those folks as they're coming in, they want to take full advantage of this emerging economic opportunity, this opportunity to make money. There's nothing wrong with us saying, that's great, but since you're asking for us to be a partner, and they always do, we're going to require that you do it on our terms. And a minimal standard, like the price of entry, is that 1 out of the 10 units that you develop have to be affordable. And then use some of the ability to generate revenue from those systems to actually do some development yourselves. And communities can do development as well. And so it's not that difficult. But if we take the position that the invisible hand of the marketplace gets to decide everything, then we miss the opportunity to preserve affordability for people who stuck it out during those lean years. And just as a matter of decent social policy, should continue to be able to be included in that community. There are really great ways to do it.
I think in Detroit right now, the rule that they have is 20% affordable. Now, affordable is usually calculated on metro-wide median income, which for it's about $30,000 or something, and so that's going to leave out a lot of people. For example, all the seniors who live on Social Security, maybe $14,000 a year, that's not going to help them. So there you need other rules. And so, for example, there's a lot of HUD subsidized housing for seniors in Detroit, where you pay the landlord a subsidy so that he or she will take some seniors making $12,000, $14,000 a year in Social Security, And as those contracts come up for renewal, there's an incentive to drop the contract and just go market rate and that force everybody to leave. And so we need to ensure that those places are going to stay available for those seniors. And you can do that, I guess, by increasing the subsidy or some other way. And as Dan said, we need to ensure that we don't just build just high-end housing. It's interesting. A lot of the first wave of gentrifiers are now being gentrified out in places like Detroit. People moved in 10 years ago who can't afford some of the rents. So, but there's still so much vacant land in Detroit. I think you could build all the new housing you want and still not touch where the people are living, have stuck it out. So.
Let me just one more thing. That's a really good point. I think the thing I strongly suggest for communities that are struggling and that have a lot of vacant land, and most local leaders, because I started a bunch of land banks around the country, about 150 of them, the biggest hurdle was getting the local officials comfortable with owning all those distressed properties. Because if you own it, then you're the one that everybody gets to come to complain about the condition of that property. But that is, I think, a relatively small price to pay to be in a position when you either create or the market creates the opportunity to develop a lot of that land. Ownership. Rule number one of urban land reform is to know your inventory, know your property, and gain control of that land when it's being abandoned. Because then you have not just subsidy, which is one way to make sure you bring down costs and ensure affordability, but having ownership of the land allows you to dictate the terms of the transaction so that over the long term, that property stays affordable whether or not it's actually receiving cash subsidy. The way we did that was every development deal, we formed an independent LLC, and my public land bank authority was a non-recourse owner. We kept 5% ownership. We didn't get any money from it, and we didn't have to pay any money if the development lost money. But as the owner, we wrote the terms of the transaction, so all the owners had to agree if there's going to be any change in the mix of affordable housing in that development. So that ability to gain control of the land, which is why I think land banks are great. But that's really the most important aspect of it, is to be able to dictate to the marketplace some conditions that are not onerous, but that reflect the values of the community and its long-term interests.
Over here. I'm getting around. Okay.
Thank you very much for your remarks. My name is Kristen. I'm with U of M's Poverty Solutions Initiative. I grew up in Flint on the north side, and I have about 60 extended family members still living there. Off of Richfield Road, live at Lynn Avenue near Holy Rosary Church when I used to be there. So my question is, thinking about...
I was born at New York
Avenue. Nice. So thinking about the ebb and flow of the economy in cities like Flint and Detroit, what are some of the strategies that you could recommend for people who, thinking forward, the workforce is growing, things are obviously getting better in some parts of Detroit. How do you keep people there instead of moving to places like Southfield or Grand Blanc or Davison or places around those cities where you want to sort of maintain that urban center and sort of the economic growth and keep people in the city?
I think one of them goes to this issue of municipal finance. People don't stay in a situation that they don't think is good for them. So, you can't incentivize people to stay in a place where the schools are really struggling and the parks are not maintained and the infrastructure is crumbling. So, I think the fundamental step is to get over this idea that all land forms are equal and that all development is equal. It's not. Cities matter. Cities are more important. I know you get some argument about that, but they are. They just flat out are. You just look at the history of the world. Read Stephen Johnson's book, Where Good Ideas Come From. Creativity, innovation, ingenuity happens where people live and work in proximity to one another. It is a reality. And so we need to have a bias that favors cities because they're really important. And so that means funding essential functions of government in those places that can sustain the ebb and flow of economic changes, because we know those places are going to be important to us again. Right now, we don't believe that way. These are throwaway places. Flint is the ultimate case study, right? The water crisis. Here's the frightening thought. There are dozens, if not more, cities that are one mistake, one miscalculation, one error away from going to the same place Flint was in through this water crisis. They're just barely hanging on like Flint was. They're struggling to try to get some energy going like Flint is. And they were allowed to get to that point where one mistake tipped them over the edge. We can't let those places get there. So how you keep people there, I think, is sort of getting back to the blocking and tackling of what a civil society is comprised of. You have to have decent parks, you have to have decent roads, you have to have water that's drinkable, you have to have schools that are not so bad that no parent would send their child to a school unless they had absolutely no other choice, which is the case in a lot of these communities. And it's sort of getting back to those fundamentals. If we don't do that, then all the other stuff we do, all the sort of episodic intervention that we might do in these places, is only going to last as long as that idea works. We've got to get back to really fundamental reform of the way we finance municipal government, and it has to start with the premise that cities are really important. They're important places.
I want to shift a little bit to the issue of jobs, because one of the concerns I have is a lot of entrepreneurial ventures don't create what we used to have as traditional jobs, and that they often are contract agencies, and the burden of a lot of costs and so forth are put back on people who are acting as independent contractors. And if you think of particularly Flint and Detroit, a lot of the economic sustainability was in the kind of jobs that went with the auto industry, et cetera. And I'm just curious your thinking about what kind of jobs and employment do you really see emerging that will sustain the economy, and then its relationship to education and training.
Well, I think when Amazon left Detroit off its short list the other day, it was interesting, and they said talent was the issue. And the percentage of Metro Detroiters who have a bachelor's degree or higher, young people who have a bachelor's degree or higher, ranked like, if the 20 cities, maybe we would be like 19th. Like almost every city on that list has a greater percentage of well-educated young people than Metro Detroit does. And there's a lot of reasons for that. It's the failure of the school system in Detroit. It's the lack of funding for the university system in Michigan. It's the student debt. Dan and I were comparing notes. His total student debt in college was zero. Mine was $600 total student debt. Nowadays we bankrupt students, giving them an education. That's got to stop. And of course, in Michigan, you had this notion that you turn 18, you walk down the street to the factory gate, and you have a job for life, and that's gone. That's been gone for a long time, but some people still think it. So I think there's no one solution like there used to be, which is the automotive industry solves all problems. Now there's a whole lot of things. You need better education, you need better public transit, you need more entrepreneurialism, you need place. Place matters. I mean, parks and community gardens and public transit and good schools. Those are economic issues as well as urban planning issues. So I think you need to do everything to make our cities better, and that itself will help generate some more jobs. But it's no easy answer. I'm not saying that there is.
I think in the long term it becomes even more difficult. With changes in technology, changes in work generally, the development of artificial intelligence, how that's going to be applied, I think we're going to have some really big challenges in terms of how we match the productive capacity with our society with sustainable support for people and families that might not be so much a part of the contribution of human labor to that productivity. It's a big challenge. In the meantime, right now, it's getting back to focusing on skills because, like, as John said, in Flint, like when I graduated from high school in 1976, I had a choice: go to the factory, either graduate or not graduate, and go to the factory and make more money than I would ever make otherwise, more likely than not, or enroll at the University of Michigan, which is what I did. 25 years later, I looked a lot smarter than I did for the 25 years that followed that decision. Because you can't, those jobs just don't exist any longer. You got to have some skills, and getting into not just access to college, but apprenticeship. Expanding the notion of apprenticeship to lots of other fields is another area that I think we need to focus. But in the long term, it becomes an even more difficult question.
I was so struck by your comment about the amount spent per child, and it leads me to ask you, is there any hope for the Detroit school system?
Well, that's a good question. I don't have an answer. I wish I did. We've been working on it for years. We've been through 5 emergency managers and 3 or 4 or 5 school boards, and the new man, Superintendent Beatty, seems to be a good guy. Seems to be working on things. As more people move into the city, as they are, they're going to demand better schools, and that may help. But I think that the schools in Detroit are the most obvious marker for how public policy has abandoned Detroit and other cities like that. And until we decide we're going to change it, it's not going to get better.
So interesting. It comes down to money. I mean, it's hard to get around that. There's not a commitment to actually fund public education, money and policy. Michigan's experiment has essentially failed. Turning public education into a marketplace has actually reduced our overall performance against our peers. We need smaller class sizes in these, especially in these urban communities, and that just costs money. And I remember fighting for that when I was on the school board in Flint. It's interesting, this thing about corporal punishment I saw up there. First thing I got involved with when I was on the Board of Education in Flint, I was 18 years old when I got elected. So I had been swatted I measured the number of months since I had been swatted with a paddle before I got on the Board of Education. Those administrators were really worried there when I first got on the board. But criminalization of behavior is another issue that disproportionately hurts these school kids in distressed places. It's just more prevalent there than it is in other places. That has an effect on the trajectory of the lives of these kids, and there's no way to ignore that. We can't.
If I could just add that that book that Dan mentioned, Our Kids by Putnam, is really a wonderful book, and makes really obvious how 50 years ago a kid from the wrong side of the tracks and a kid from the right side of the tracks could basically have similar outcomes, and that's no longer true. Now you have this wide divergence, and so that social mobility is really eroding dramatically in America, and your outcome in life is often determined by how you start out, and it shouldn't be that way.
Thank you both for your comments. My name is Gabby. I'm actually from Southwest Detroit. Congressman Dan Kildee, thank you very much for holding it down, the government shutdown for Dreamers. Nothing until we get that, but thank you for doing that. You mentioned, as someone that's worked for nonprofits and for the county, and you mentioned that we need to think of new ways of investments. I'm interested in knowing what those ways are outside of taxes, outside of money and grants coming in from the federal government. Because yes, we run municipalities as governments, as businesses. It's cutting budgets, all those things, which then cuts services. I was on a grant for 5 new Head Starts in Wayne County, which then we lost because my second point is we also run municipalities as nonprofits where people are stressed out, they don't know what to do, they lack resources and training. So can you speak in what are these new investments that you're thinking about, and also about, yes, new leadership, new politicians and working in policy, but also administration, because really it's administrators working in these offices that work with politicians every day that push things forward. So if you can, from your insights of how people working in government and how to make us more money to actually provide services.
So this is one of those areas where it gets to the large policy debate that we have going on at the state level and at the federal level, and it's whether or not we think it's um, acceptable to be this enormously wealthy country and not make the kind of investments that we ought to make to ensure that everybody gets to participate in the enormity of that wealth. And we just don't. We just plain don't. When I was working on the Flint water recovery effort, being a kid of Flint, I felt like I needed to go to Congress. I'm in Congress and I had to get something done. We got a big chunk of money. We got $170 million through Congress, which was great. But, it's not that much money when you think about the size of the problem. So what I sat down with my team and we wrote a piece of legislation. It's called the Families of Flint Act. And we decided, let's just not think about the political reality. Let's just think about what are the investments that we would like to have that would essentially bring justice for the people of Flint based on what happened to them. And we thought, well, these kids have had their futures affected potentially. So what would it take to make sure that they can overcome that? And so we came up with this thing that every kid should be able to go to a decent school with good technology. It's safe. They ought to have parks that are mowed in the neighborhood. They ought to have access to early childhood education to the extent that their parents want to engage in it. They ought to have relatively small class sizes, and they ought to have a school nurse. They ought to be able to have after-school programs. They ought to be able to go to the doctor if they're sick. They ought to be able to have a summer job if they are so inclined. And we put it all together, and we said, this is the Families of Flint Act. And so we turned it into legislation. And then I said to myself, wait a minute, this is what every kid ought to have, right? And it's what most kids who live in affluent communities already have. We don't even think about it. So this is where I think the role of government and the role of society, government's a tool of our society, is that when we live in a time and a place where we have vast wealth, we ought to at least be able to figure out a way to create the kind of investment in those places. If we just started with those things I mentioned, they seem so simple, but we actually don't have those. In Flint, the parks are not mowed. In Flint, thank God, because of the water crisis, we have more kids that have access to really high quality early childhood education. It's really good stuff, but it's not all of them because we're not paying for all of them to do it. An early elementary class size, it's not unusual for it to be 35 kids. We have some after school program, but not all kids get a chance to do those things because there's just not enough money to do it. The summer jobs, and I know the mayor of Detroit has really been working on summer employment too, but it's still not enough for all of them. Those seem like pretty basic levels of investment. Now, if we were to do those things, if we had what I just described, the interest in private investment in those places might not be great, but it would be a lot more than it is right now. The idea that a community is going to be able to attract new private investment when the parks aren't mowed, the schools are bad, roads are crumbling, kids don't have anything to do in the afternoon, it's very unlikely that we're going to. And those are basically entry level requirements, I think, to a civil society in the wealthiest country ever imagined. Today, by the way, we set a record. Most wealth ever assembled by a single country in the history of the world. And guess what? Tomorrow we're going to break that record again. And the day after that, we'll break it again. We don't anyone tell you that all this stuff that it sounds like I'm some sort of a left-leaning progressive politician who just wants to spend money. It's the smartest money we could ever spend. We get it all back.
Let me just quickly add that, as Dan said, the money's out there, and it's how we direct it. Now, sometimes it takes a crisis so that once Detroit filed for bankruptcy, municipal bankruptcy, money came out of the woodwork. Hundreds of millions of dollars came out of the woodwork, even from Lansing, of all places, which I thought was impossible, threw hundreds of millions of dollars at the Detroit bankruptcy, and rescued the art from the DIA and shored up city pensions, municipal pensions. So I don't know what it takes. It might take a crisis. It might take creative thinking. You said you're from Southwest Detroit, right? So, Kathy Wendler engineered that bid, the Business Improvement District, which was did provided millions of dollars for cleanup and streetlights and graffiti removal. So the money's out there. You have to be kind of creative in how you do it. Hopefully, it doesn't take a crisis, but we just have to figure out whether it's public policy or whatever it is. We got to direct the money differently than we do.
How's it going? I'm Joel. I'm also from Southwest. And I just had a question regarding like land banks. So how do you safeguard against speculation and delinquent ownership that could come with like land banks and auctions of land?
How to keep speculators out of it?
Yeah, speculators and like delinquent owners.
Well, one thing is, the way it's, and Dan is, I'll let Dan talk about this, but it's the county treasurer that auctions off the land, and that's where it can get in the hands of speculators. And by putting in the land bank, you can eliminate that problem because you control who gets it. But I'll let.
Yeah. The most important way is to have policies that govern the disposition of the land. Without a land bank, it's a public auction, and you don't know, and you can't really dictate who gets the property. And I mean the tax auction. There's different. They call some of the sales they do through the land bank, they call an auction here, but it's not really a pure auction. The way to do it is to gain control of the property. If you get it through tax foreclosure, put it in the land bank, and then have very clear, publicly adopted priorities for, number one, the use of the land. Like, what is the use you want to see? Is home ownership, for example, the highest use of the land? So if you have competing interests that want to get a particular piece of property, even though they might offer different sums of money, the one who will put it into home ownership goes to the front of the line. That's one. And then the other set of criteria is, to whom do we want to sell this property? You can have a criteria that says for local residents first, even though they might not have the resource to outbid somebody at an auction. They bring value to the table, not only in the sense that they have a stake in what happens to that property because they live here, but it also potentially puts that person in a position of being economically empowered by being able to use that land to generate some revenue that they can then use to support their family. Those policies, number one, they have to be really clearly articulated and publicly adopted. And secondly, it has to be scrutinized to make sure that there's integrity in those systems. And that's really fundamentally how land banks keep speculators to a minimum. I won't say totally out. And auctions really are a bonanza for speculators. I don't like auctions. I don't believe you should ever sell property through an auction. Nobody ever got up in the morning and said, hey, we're going to move, kids. So you grab your spouse and your kids and you say, hey, let's run down to the public auction and see what's available. No, you go, you negotiate a transaction. That's the way we ought to deal with all land. Land is as valuable as you treat it. And a lot of times it's forgotten.
So I've only lived in Detroit about a year, but I work in a school in Southwest Detroit, and I'm wondering how you see like the development of the Little Caesars Arena and the Illage Empire, and how there's money there, but it's being used to build stadiums instead of schools. And so how do you challenge that type of development? And maybe they've been in the city a long time, but the priorities, how do you challenge those priorities?
Well, personally, I think that there's plenty of money and plenty of room for both. I think you can have a great downtown with all the arenas and all that stuff, and also have good neighborhoods. So I don't think it's either or. In terms of how do you direct resources, it's got to be political action, either at the local level, the city council level, and this administration is pretty good about meeting with residents and having public hearings and all that sort of stuff. Or higher up the chain at the Lansing level, at the federal level. So if people get out and voted in 2016 the way they did in previous presidential elections, we'd have a whole different story today. I like to say when President Obama was first elected, there were 13 million people who voted in his first election who did not vote 2 years later when the Republicans took over Congress. and they were almost all Democrats. So, political action, getting involved, that's how you direct it. I think that people like the Illiches and Dan Gilbert get a lot of criticism. Some of it's justified, some of it's not. But I mean, I'm certainly happy that we have Comerica Park and the Fox Theater and all that stuff downtown. I just don't think it means we can't have all the good stuff in the neighborhoods that we want.
I have one question about the property tax. You mentioned that we need entrepreneurship and nonprofit organization to improve improve the quality of a community, such as education, employment, and relieving like spatial inequality patterns, something like that. And however, my question is, how could you deal with like property tax? For example, the availability of tax exempt property goes up, the city suffers from tax shortage, which produce another problem. For example, the business in the city will like complain about, oh, we pay property taxes, but these nonprofit organization and entrepreneurs get some tax exempt. So my question is, how could you make this balance like property tax?
Yeah. Well, personally, I think that the property tax on residential property is one of the worst property taxes. And here's an interesting statistic: what percentage does the property tax on single-family homes pay to the city of Detroit as part of their total revenue? It's less than 10%. So we could eliminate that tax, and we'd have to replace the revenue somehow. But it's not like that's what pays for government. There's lots of other things that pay for government. So I think that the property tax is probably not the best way to do this. And I think, and I'll let Dan, the former tax man, talk about this in more detail. But I think you could eliminate that tax and you'd get rid of all the inequalities that are in it. For example, in Michigan, we have this system now under Proposal A where your property tax, say in my home in Detroit, goes up very little until I sell it, and then it gets a big bump. And so, my wife and I pay something like $3,000 a year property tax on our condo in Detroit. And if we sold it, the next guy would pay $6,000 or $7,000 or $8,000 a year. That makes no sense to me whatsoever. So I think that system, along with everything else we've talked about, needs reform.
Yeah, I believe there's a lot of room for property tax reform. Michigan's system is not good. It's not the worst. Pennsylvania's is the worst by far. I've done a lot of work around the country on property tax reform. Here's the challenge. The problem is that it may only be 10% in Detroit. In some communities, it's significantly higher because you don't have the mix of industrial and commercial properties, or you don't have an income tax that's very formidable. So there's a heavier dependence on locally generated revenues now than there was, say, even a decade ago. I'll just give you one example. In Flint, Flint is bankrupt essentially, even though technically it's not. Because and at the point in time that the emergency manager took it over, it had $20 million of debt that it couldn't repay the state, and it didn't have a lot of debt otherwise. It was $40 or $50 million underwater. The state had cut revenue sharing to the city, and over a period of about 8 years, the city had lost $50 million from the state government, so they have to offset that. One to your other point, to the point about property taxation, one of the tools that I pushed when I ran a think tank for a while. It's called the Center for Community Progress, and we worked on all these reforms. One of the things that we pushed in a lot of places, couldn't get it done here, is to sort of invert the way property taxation deals with occupied productive property versus vacant and abandoned property. And so we developed a policy whereby we tried to minimize the property tax burden on occupied productive property by having a vacant property tax, which accelerated went up in scale the longer the property was vacant. So if you held a property vacant for 10 years in the city, fasten your seatbelts. And it was based on the notion that those places cost us more than an occupied property does, because the externalities of a vacant property is really negative. So why do we all have to pay for somebody else's decision to speculate on empty land in a city? So these vacant property registration ordinances, VPROs they're called, come with a fee that accelerates the longer you hold the property vacant. To me, that was a way to sort of turn the table on the burden that people end up accepting for being in a shrinking city. Because when the city shrinks, the cost of operating governmental services does not shrink. It just gets spread among fewer and fewer taxpayers, and so the bill goes up. We flipped that idea on its head. Not a lot of communities had the will to do it, but some who did really benefited.
Well, first, I just wanted to say that you talked about land banks and how important it was for cities to get control of how that property is going to be used. And I thought I've heard that in Sweden, the government owns all the land in Sweden, that nobody owns land privately there. So I thought I'd pass that on to you. I have my first question is.
Norway is very popular these days, too.
For their oil, of course. But the problem of privatization, the Republicans seem to have this master plan that they're playing out all over the country, and especially in Michigan, with all three branches in the Republican hands. And it's like schools, public services, parks, everything is to be privatized. Nothing can be utilities. And that's, I think, a major problem that I'd like to have both of you address. And the other is something related to that, which is gentrification. And it seems that it's really rare to find a city that seems to be able to, I don't know of any examples where cities are able to stop or do something to negate gentrification, where the rich end up living in the city and the poor people end up living out in the suburbs, having to take a bus for an hour and a half in.
Yeah, so first on the issue of privatization, I think there are good case studies that show that privatization of certain public functions can work. Privatization of some public functions should never be pursued. My sort of basic take on this, and for all my time in local government and now at the federal level, is that when you have an essential public function which is unique to the public institution, that privatization, generally speaking, does not bring much to the table except the ability to export the profitability of that function to somebody else. Where I think sometimes governments think you have to privatize, like a water system, for example, like by selling it, rather than taking advantage of the capacity in the marketplace for operational support by contracting on a fee basis for operational support, but holding the asset and holding you can't really have profit in government, but it's called surplus, we call it. Retaining that, I think, is the way to use the strength of private enterprise in a way that does not sacrifice public functions to become for-profit operations or enterprises. And the public school, and this is an opinion that not everybody may share, so warning, the public school system here is a prime example of that. The state has fully privatized public education in part through the development of charters that can be for-profit charters. Just look at the data, and it tells us all we need to know. It has made it worse for the traditional public school system, and the return on that investment with better performance has not been realized at all. So it's a good example of what not to do. What President Trump has been talking about is privatization of public infrastructure. I think that's a big mistake. If we collectively own the asset, we all should be able to benefit from whatever economic value that asset has. If we need somebody to help us operate it so that the operational efficiencies can be realized, that's fine. But that's different than full privatization of a public function. I think there are some things that are inherently public, and then there are some there's some moral hazard involved here. I mean, the idea that privatization of prisons is a good thing means that there's a private sector incentive, there's a profit incentive in more people being imprisoned, and there's no way to separate that incentive from the public policy decisions that are made regarding incarceration. I think that's a really slippery slope. And so that to me is the measure, is if you can go to the marketplace to find capacity, hire the capacity, don't sell the asset. And I think in many cases it's an excuse because governments could be more efficient and figure out ways to be more efficient and operate some of these things themselves. The other question was gentrification, which we kind of touched on. It's the way you write the deal. It's the way you get in control of the land and being more prescriptive to the market as to how you want to have your land utilized. Is one of the best ways to gentrification.
Yeah, all the spin-offs that I talked about earlier, Eastern Market, those are still owned by the city of Detroit, so they have not been privatized in that sense. They are now managed privately. They usually have nonprofit boards of some kind. A lot of the boards are staffed by city officials and so on. And there's a professional management who comes into Cobo Center or Eastern Market. So that's not privatization. I agree with Dan. I am against privatizing prisons, air traffic control, any of that stuff, because it just creates the wrong incentives. I think that the example of the Ambassador Bridge, which has been privately owned, is an example of what happens when you have major public infrastructure that it's privately owned. So in terms of gentrification, I think that there's this balance between, we want new investment in the city, we want people to move back into the city, but we don't want to kick out the people who have stuck it out and have been faithful to the city. So how you do that balance, by controlling the land sales, by requiring affordable housing, through a host of other policies, I think that's the important thing. So. Well, Detroit is trying to do that. I mean, if you have all these these projects in downtown and midtown Detroit, almost all of those have some set asides for affordable units. Now, again, there's the issue of what affordable means. But there's a dozen or 15 or 20 projects in downtown that have set aside for affordable housing.
Yeah, the reason there's not a lot of is that the tools to gain control of land are relatively recently developed tools, and there aren't very many cities that have taken the hard step of gaining control of their land and that have actually been fortunate enough to have to struggle with how to reconcile new investment with affordability. So we haven't, the land bank that I started was really the first of its kind. And we started that in between 2002 and 2004 is when we began developing all the systems. So that question is what really led to the answer that I helped to propose, and we really haven't had many good examples of it so far.
Yeah, the land bank in Detroit is only 4 or 5 years old, and the ordinance that requires 20% affordable housing was passed like last year or so. So we're pretty at the front end of this.
Can you say something about what the land bank is? I realize now it's there used to be the idea you could never put together projects.
Yeah.
What was owned.
I'll give you the really quick version. So a land bank is a public authority that is formed to acquire, manage, and then repurpose vacant, abandoned, and distressed properties. Most states, the way we've written the land bank laws, they get the majority of the property through tax foreclosure. Property taxes are not paid on the property. It used to be in the old days, we would sell the right to pay the taxes to private speculators through tax sales, and then they could gain control of those properties. And so if you had 10,000 vacant properties in Flint, you probably had 5,000 owners. The way the land bank works is we just reorder the process so that if anyone's going to benefit from speculation on that property, it's the community itself. And so rather than selling by auction, the land bank can assemble those properties rather than selling them to hundreds of different owners in a particular neighborhood over a period of years. They can acquire a quarter or a third of the property and then develop a redevelopment strategy and then seek private investors that are willing to invest based on the parameters that the land bank determines.
Does an impressive land bank have eminent domain?
No. I have always pushed back on the use of eminent domain for land banks because land banks are one step removed from direct election. It has a board of directors. My view is that if the municipality itself wouldn't use their powers of eminent domain to acquire property, that we shouldn't empower another authority to do that. But for the most part, we haven't had to do that. Like I've developed a lot of property in Flint when I was running the land bank. I got most of the property through tax foreclosure, but the sort of transformative projects that I developed, the land bank just went out and purchased those properties, rather than go through eminent domain, because it brings such a it just creates a lot of upset.
Okay, we have a question here. Then I'll ask if you guys would remain further and ask more questions, or we want to stop at that. Go ahead.
I had 15 questions, but I'll narrow it down to one. I'm really glad that we're talking about tax foreclosure because it's an issue that affects Detroit and Flint and many other places, but we're kind of talking about those today. I'm glad we're talking about it. I actually co-run a tax foreclosure prevention nonprofit in Detroit, and going back, Congressman, to what you were talking about earlier, I think it's great, this city and towns initiative to encourage investment, but tax foreclosure, the law is a state law, and that disproportionately impacts low income cities like Detroit and Flint. And so, I obviously want more money, but I also think that there can be better processes coming from the state that help, that don't take away opportunities that residents have, and don't take away assets that they already have, like their home. So there's a lot of state laws that predict city outcomes. There's tax foreclosure, there's corporate handouts, Brownsfield laws, obviously impacting downtown Detroit right now, emergency management, which takes away democracy, predominantly in Black cities across the state. And so I'm wondering, how, other than financial investment, can we, from the state level, encourage different policies, laws, making or removing, to better assess the needs of cities? Because we have the money, we have tax money coming in. I also want to say that the city of Detroit made millions of dollars off of the November tax foreclosure auction, which it would not have made if those people had just paid their taxes. They profit off of this auction. There's not necessarily incentive for it to go away anytime soon.
Well, if we want to go down this, there are probably 10 experts on tax foreclosure in the country. And I'm one of them. So we could really talk about this if we wanted to.
Sure.
First of all, when it comes to tax foreclosure, it's not whether there is tax foreclosure or not that is the question. Because the truth of the matter is, without tax foreclosure, the vacant property next door to the homeowner could sit for 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. The question is, how do we ensure that the process of enforcing tax policy and ensuring that taxes are paid is done in a way that supports our values? And I helped write the law, but so don't let someone tell you, and I don't want to get anybody in trouble here, but don't let anyone tell you that the local government's hands are tied when it comes to tax foreclosure. I was the county treasurer for 13 years. I did not foreclose on homeowners because I had the authority to postpone foreclosure, put people on payment plans, and to work with the local government Because if someone's living in poverty, and we actually need, there are some changes in state law that would be helpful in this regard, but it is not true that every person who owns a house has to pay property taxes. If you live in poverty, you should be able to get a poverty exemption. What I pushed for and stretched the law as far as I could stretch it was to give people, essentially give them exemptions in arrears. Number one. Secondly, if I ever got to the point where somebody was about to lose their home, I could figure out a way to make sure that didn't happen just by using the tools of the land bank, essentially allowing them to stay and figure out a way to get them caught up on those taxes or get those taxes erased through the process of the poverty exemption in arrears. The real question is not whether there is or isn't tax foreclosure. The question is whether those tools are used in a way that is consistent with the community's values. And what I argued, and I will argue forever, is that losing the tax revenue by figuring out a way to keep a homeowner in their home. So what do you lose? So you somehow get them a poverty exemption in arrears, or you put them on a life lease or whatever it is. You figure out a way, and you can figure it out, believe me. You figure out a way to keep them in that property without having them to have to pay the few $100s in taxes. The value of keeping them in that home is so much greater than the tiny money you get by enforcing on them without applying the community values. It's just not worth it. It's not worth it. No question about it. But what's not acceptable is to have that tool in your hand and not apply it to a slumlord who owns the house next door, who never does anything to that house, who charges people exorbitant rent because they can't find a path forward to get into their home. And without having a whole toolbox available, including the ability to say to them, if you're not paying your fair share, you're not paying, and believe me, the vast majority, in my case, nearly every single property that we foreclosed was non-owner occupied. You should not foreclose on owner-occupied property, and you don't have to. The tools are there. They just have to be used. When I was the county treasurer, I funded my own tax foreclosure prevention program in my office, and then I hired Legal Services of Eastern Michigan, signed a waiver of conflict, and paid them to go find homeowners to object to my petition of foreclosure so I didn't miss anybody. I didn't want their house. And you can do that under the law. I helped write the law. So often what you'll find, and I'm not trying to suggest any particular people, but it's just a lot easier to not do that hard work. It's just a lot easier to just say, we're just doing it all. We're just going to do them all. We're not going to get into these cases and treat them like the individual stories that they really are. I ended up meeting with, and this was thousands of them, thousands and thousands. So we actually did it at scale. The real question is, do these tools of government operate on autopilot, or do they have some underlying values that are supposed to be applied in the way we use them? And if we don't do it in the latter form, then there isn't a system. There is no system that you can devise that's not going to have all sorts of really negative consequences. Anyway, sorry, I didn't need to go long on that.
Okay, so we're at 7 o'clock, and so I think we're going to, do you guys mind staying around for a few minutes to talk to people who have a few additional questions at the end? So I'd like to thank Congressman Kildee and Mr. Gallagher. And anyone who is not in the class who's here, would you mind just signing so we can have a record of who came? And thank you again for coming this evening.